I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Gout may be one of the oldest known forms of arthritis, but it remains widely misunderstood, undertreated, and a source of silent suffering for millions of people who are often blamed for their disease rather than offered effective care. Current therapies to lower urate levels suffer from limitations and safety challenges. Crystalys Therapeutics is in late-stage development of a next-generation urate inhibitor that's already approved in Japan and China. Crystalys CEO James Mackay discusses the biology of gout, why standard therapies often fail to get uric acid to target levels, and how the company's next-generation urate-1 inhibitor may fill the treatment gap and change daily life for patients living with moderate to severe gout. James, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Danny.
We're going to talk about gout, Crystalys, and its efforts to develop a new treatment for this condition. Let's start with the disease itself, which is a form of inflammatory arthritis. What causes gout, and what's happening inside the body when someone develops it?
Yeah, so as you indicated, Danny, gout is actually the most common form of inflammatory arthritis, and the biology behind it is really straightforward. So basically, gout is caused by excess uric acid in the body, and that can be caused by either or both the overproduction of uric acid, which is mainly linked to diet, or the underexcretion of uric acid, which is basically your kidneys are not excreting enough uric acid. And what's important about gout is that about 85% of people who develop gout develop it because their kidneys can't excrete enough uric acid. And then because of that, the uric acid starts to accumulate in the body and be deposited in the joints and other tissues. And that's essentially what causes the disease.
While gout is a form of arthritis, it's not an autoimmune disease, but it's characterized by flares and periods of remission. What causes gout to flare? Is it understood?
Yeah, it is. So a gout flare is an acute inflammatory response and it's actually caused by the buildup of the monosodium urate crystals in the joint. So you get excess uric acid in the body. It's deposited in the joints, and these are needle-shaped crystals that basically trigger the immune system. They basically cause white blood cells to release inflammatory cytokines, and then those cytokines result in intense pain, swelling, redness, and heat on the joint. There can be many triggers to a gout flare. It could be, as we talked about earlier, due to diet, a high purine rich diet, or it can be just caused by the increased levels of uric acid in the body because the body can't excrete enough. I think one of the things I like to describe is there was a description of this by a gentleman called Dr. Robert Wortman. I think this kind of summarizes the flare up for me. He said, and I'm going to read this, he said, uric acid crystals can be thought of like matches, which can sit quietly or can be ignited. He says crystals can be present for years in the body without causing inflammation. Then at some point, due to an increasing number of crystals or some other factor, the matches are struck and the inflammation begins. So I think that's a very nice analogy about how a gout flare takes place.
And how does gout typically manifest itself?
Yeah, so people There are over 50 million people in the US that have elevated levels of uric acid. It's what's called asymptomatic hyperuricemia. So those 50 million people are walking about not knowing that there's anything wrong with them. And about 15 million of those will develop gout. And what happens initially, normally what happens is that a person will have a gout flare. So they'll have this sudden intense attack of pain in the joint, normally the foot or the hands. And they'll normally think that they've broken a bone or something. It often results in an emergency room visit, which of course is a very expensive way to get medical treatment. Um, and ultimately, once individuals have had X-rays done or whatever, then they'll take some blood samples and they'll find that there's elevated uric acid in the blood, and that's how gout is diagnosed.
And this often can present just in the toe, is that correct?
Yeah, normally what happens is, and it's to do with the temperature. The gout crystals, become there's a temperature gradient in the body. So in the extremities, you're more likely to see crystallization of the uric acid. And so, often it'll be depicted as the big toe, get a big red inflamed toe. That's just because it's in an extremity in the body. But what I think is important, Danny, is that uric acid is not only deposited in the joints, it's deposited elsewhere in the body. And I somewhat liken it to the cholesterol story. So, for years gone back, people walked about with elevated levels of cholesterol in their body. They didn't know that. They didn't feel unwell until suddenly they had a heart attack. And now people get their cholesterol tested regularly. With gout, people are walking about with elevated levels of uric acid, which are depositing throughout the body, causing local inflammation, but the patient doesn't know that until they experience a gout flare or they start to develop tophi, which are deposits of uric acid on the joints. So I think, although we use the term asymptomatic hyperuricemia to talk about patients who, have got high levels of uric acid but haven't developed gout, it's not really an accurate description because those individuals are suffering inflammation throughout the body, even though they're not having a gout flare.
Well, it leads to an interesting question: is there a progression or damage that's done to the body over time by having undetected increased levels of uric acid?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the uric acid, as I said, will not only be deposited in the joints, it'll deposit all over the body in the kidneys, probably importantly in the cardiovascular system. In Japan, they actually proactively treat asymptomatic hyperuricemia because their treatment guidelines believe that, probably quite rightly, that elevated uric acid, deposited in the cardiovascular system causes localized inflammation, and that results in increased levels of cardiovascular events. So this is a disease that progresses over years and sometimes even decades before people will actually experience a gout flare. And you're constantly getting inflammation in the body, which of course we all know is not a good thing.
So obviously, gout's been around a long time. How well treated is the condition with existing therapies?
So there's not been much innovation in the gout drug development space. The standard of care is a drug called allopurinol, that's a xanthine oxidase inhibitor. It reduces the production of uric acid. Um, but about two-thirds of people who are treated with allopurinol don't actually achieve uric acid target level. The target level for control of uric acid is to be less than 6 mg per deciliter. So the standard of care is not particularly good at doing that. There is a second xanthine oxidase inhibitor called febuxostat, or what the branded name was uric. Slightly better molecule than allopurinol, but actually now has a boxed warning for cardiovascular risk. So it's not used very much in the US because most gout patients have got comorbid cardiovascular conditions. If people fail allopurinol or febuxostat, there's really nothing in the second line treatment space right now. And that's where we're targeting the development of datinurad. There is a third line treatment option, which is an IV uricase called Crystalys that was marketed by Horizon Pharmaceuticals, now marketed by Amgen. That's a very effective but difficult to use uricase. It requires a multi-hour IV infusion. It's a very effective drug, but a significant portion of patients develop anti-drug antibodies. It's also very expensive, and therefore, I think that limits its utility in a broader patient population. So we're targeting that very large second line space where, we believe there's a significant unmet medical need.
Let me ask you about the what daily life is with gout. Is there a social or work impact? Is there an emotional or physical impact that's associated with people who have this disease?
Yeah, so first of all, gout has a bit of a stigma. I mean, when I talk to people about we're developing treatments for gout, their first reaction often is, does that disease exist anymore? And how wrong they could be to think that it doesn't exist anymore, because over 15 million people in the US suffer from this disease, but they in general suffer in silence. And I think there's two reasons for that. One, gout is misunderstood. People will often indicate that it's a kind of a blame situation, that people are eating the wrong diet. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that's actually a very small percentage of gout patients that can control their disease by diet. The vast majority just can't excrete enough uric acid. So patients are kind of made to feel guilty. I think that's compounded by the fact, going back to your previous question, that there aren't really very many treatment options for gout. So the physicians, to be fair to them, don't really have very many options available to them. And therefore, they'll tend to default to trying to push this back on the patient. I think the other thing that contributes to, the less than desirable treatment that gout patients receive is the fact that most of these gout patients will have multiple other comorbid conditions. They'll have diabetes, they'll have high blood pressure, or other conditions like that, deterioration in their kidney functions or chronic kidney disease. And often those are higher up the priority list for the physicians to treat. But I think by bringing, some innovation into this space, we'll be able to bring, a new medicine here that will actually give the physicians the option to treat patients in a different way, and will also, help patients be empowered to, demand better treatment than they're getting today.
I do want to talk about what you're working on, but I think before you do, it might help to have you explain what URAT1 is and the role it plays in gout.
Yeah, URAT1 is a renal transporter. It works in what's called the proximal tubule of the kidney. And it's a transporter that's responsible for reabsorbing uric acid back into the body after it's been processed through the kidney. So basically, you know, s- the body will excrete uric acid, and then the URAT1 transporter will reabsorb it back into the body. Um, I talked at the beginning about the fact that most gout patients have gout because they can't excrete enough uric acid. So what we do is we block the URAT1 transporter, which blocks the reabsorption of the uric acid, and therefore basically makes people urinate out more uric acid. So it's pretty simple biology here. We're really trying to get more uric acid out of the body, and our drug works directly on the main issue of not being able to excrete enough uric acid.
You actually helped develop and launch Zerampic, the first URAT1 inhibitor in the United States. How did that experience, both the scientific success and the subsequent commercial withdrawal of the drug shape your thinking about Crystalys?
Yeah, very much so. So as you said, we developed Zurampic. We also developed fixed dose combination with allopurinol, Zurampic, which was called Duzalo, and got approval for both of those in the US and Europe. Um, the challenge that we had with that molecule is that it had a renal tox liability. And that turned out to be somewhat challenging. So when we sought approval for that molecule, we actually chose the lower dose level that we'd studied in the phase 3 clinical trials because we considered that the higher dose level did not have an acceptable risk benefit profile because of the renal toxicity. And I can talk more if you want about why we believe that molecule had that renal toxicity. So we sought approval for the lower dose level, 200 milligrams that we developed, because the renal side effect profile at that dose was very similar to the active comparator in the trials. So, and the FDA agreed, so did the European authorities, that it had an acceptable benefit risk profile. The challenge was, however, because we had chosen the lower dose level, we had less efficacy, so the drug was less effective than we'd been hoping for. And unfortunately, even though the renal profile for the 200 milligram dose was acceptable from the FDA's perspective, they actually put a box warning on for what was seen at the 400 milligram dose level. And that then turned out to be very challenging from a commercialization perspective because you had a drug that was less effective than people had hoped it was going to be. And then it also had this boxed warning for a renal tox issue. So those two things, ultimately resulted in that molecule not being commercially successful. And, when we decided to step back into the gout space, obviously we wanted to take all the learnings into consideration. We wanted a molecule that was much more potent than Zurampic had been. And we obviously wanted to see if we could find a molecule that did not have the renal tox liability that Zurampic had. And we believe that we found that in Datinurad, the molecule that we're developing.
How did Crystalys come about?
Yeah, so my previous company, and you and I talked when I was there, was Aristea Therapeutics, which is a clinical stage immunology company. And our lead investor there was an investment firm called Novo Ventures. And after we closed Aristea Therapeutics, Novo Ventures came back to me and said, look, obviously, Aristea Therapeutics didn't work out the way we were expecting it to. We had an unexpected liver tox issue with our molecule that resulted in us terminating the program and closing the company. But Novo indicated that it's still been a good experience for them. They were interested in working with us again, and that they, as an investment firm, had become very interested in the gout drug development space. So they approached us and asked us if we would be prepared to co-create a company together and see if we could find a gout medicine that was worthy of investment. So we agreed to do that, but in the same time, we also were introduced to a second venture capital firm called Crystalys Pacific. That's a Japanese-based venture capital firm that specializes in identifying assets that have approval in Japan, but the rights are available in the US and Europe. And we decided to combine forces across the management team, Novo Ventures and Crystalys Pacific, to actually found Crystalys Therapeutics. And then we went looking for all the gout drug development molecules, all the molecules that were in development. And we identified this molecule called Datinurad that actually came from a small Japanese pharma that the Crystalys Pacific had identified and decided to move forward with that. So that's how the company came about. It's a little bit the reverse of what normally happens. So in this case, the investors came to us and asked us if we were prepared to co-found the company with us, and then we went to look for a molecule to develop.
Mechanistically, how do urate 1 inhibitors like Datinurad alter uric acid handling in the kidney and ultimately lower serum uric acid?
Yeah, so basically they basically block the URAT1 transporter, and that results in you excreting more uric acid than you would do otherwise. So it's a well understood um, mechanism of action, and is the same mechanism of action that we previously got approval for. When we were at Ardea Biosciences, where we developed Zurampic.
As a next generation URAT1 inhibitor, what differentiates donatorad from earlier drugs in the class?
Yeah, so I think two things that I mentioned earlier. So the Datinurad is much more efficacious than the previous molecule that we got approval for. It's about 1,000-fold more efficacious. And then secondly, the safety profile. So Datinurad, what it does not have a renal tox liability. The thing that attracted us particularly to Datinurad was that the molecule was developed by a Japanese pharma called Fuji Yakuhin and was actually approved in Japan in 2020. It's also now approved in China. And there are no requirements for renal monitoring based on the clinical trial programs conducted in Japan and China. But what's even probably more important than that is that over 2.2 million patients have received the drug in a post-marketing setting in Japan, and there's been no change to the prescribing information over a 5-year period. So very large safety database, very stable safety profile with no indication that there's any renal tox liability. So, potency of the molecule and safety profile were really the two key differentiators for us as we identified Datinurad as a molecule that we wanted to work on.
And as a medicine that's been approved in Japan, what's known about the clinical experience to date?
Yeah, so the drug is used quite broadly in Japan. The uptake over a 5-year period has been impressive. The drug is used slightly differently in Japan. In that I mentioned earlier that the Japanese believe that you should proactively treat asymptomatic hyperuricemia even before people develop gout, because of the increased cardiovascular burden that the uric acid causes. So they treat people proactively. So everyone in Japan has their uric acid tested regularly. That's not the case in the US or in Europe. And if your uric acid is above a certain level, the Japanese treatment guidelines require the physician to treat you in order to get your uric acid under control. And as a result of that, um, uh, moderate to severe gout, or people developing tophi, which are the deposits of uric acid on the joints, that doesn't tend to happen in Japan. So slightly different treatment approach there. The treatment approach in China is more similar to the US. The drug is just being launched in China by Fuji's partner Eisai. There, we don't have any commercial experience with that molecule yet, but we will do over the coming year.
Crystalys is now running two phase 3 trials, Ruby and Topaz. Can you outline the study designs, who's being enrolled, the primary endpoints, and the duration or follow up?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're developing Datinurad as a specialty care treatment for moderate to severe gout. So we wanted to study in the phase 3 trials exactly the patient who's going to be sitting opposite the rheumatologist when they're making a prescribing decision. So basically, the patients that are enrolled into Ruby and Topaz all have to be failing on standard of care allopurinol. So all patients have to be on a stable physician determined dose of allopurinol. They have to have at least 2 flares in the previous 12 months. And they have to have a uric acid level that's above target. So in our case, above 6.5 mgs per deciliter. So basically, they're failing on allopurinol. And those patients will then be randomized either to continue their existing allopurinol dose or they'll stop taking allopurinol and be randomized to ditinurad. We have two trials. The first trial is focused on gout flare, and that's a 500 patient trial. The treatment period there is a 15-month treatment period. So we'll see data from that trial probably somewhere in the region of Q1 2028. The second trial, the patients also have to be failing on allopurinol, but they also have to have tophaceous gout. So they have to have deposits of uric acid on the joints. And that trial is being designed to investigate our ditinurad's ability to resolve or dissolve the tophi. And that because that takes longer, we're actually treating those patients for 18 months, and we'll see data from that trial probably in Q2 2028. So although both those trials have been designed and powered based on those clinical symptomology endpoints, the primary endpoint for all gout drug development trials is the proportion of patients achieving target serum uric acid level of less than 6 mg per deciliter, or less than 5 mg per deciliter if you have tophaceous gout, because that's what the FDA and the European authorities expect as the regulatory endpoint. But our trials program has been designed to go beyond that and actually deliver clinical symptom improvement, which we feel is obviously critically important for the patients, the physicians, and ultimately for the payers in terms of them allowing access and reimbursement to the drug once it's on the market.
Well, are you doing things in the phase 3 to capture patient-centered outcomes?
Yeah, we are. We're doing a number. We're using what's called a HAQ-DI. It's a disability questionnaire. It's commonly used in rheumatological diseases. So, for example, rheumatoid arthritis, and that's a validated patient-reported outcome. We're also using the physical component of another health survey called SF36. And then we're also doing what's called a patient global assessment, where the patient will do an overall assessment of the disease and how they feel. And then specifically for the tophaceous trial, we're also doing a patient-reported outcome that's called the TIQ-20, which basically the patients will report, what it feels like from a tophus perspective. So I think we've got some really good patient-reported outcomes there that'll actually, enhance the rest of the clinical data that we'll see from the trials.
Given there seems to be a strong regulatory use of a biomarker, given that this drug is already approved in Japan, is it changing your thinking on how to approach your regulatory strategy in the United States or Europe?
Yeah, so after we licensed the molecule, we designed the phase 3 program, and we designed that very much with the significant Asian exposure in mind. The 1,300 patients have received the drug in clinical trials in Japan and China, and then, as I said, over 2.2 million patients have received the drug so far. We estimate that by the time we file our regulatory submissions that we could have 8 to 10 million patients in that post-marketing setting. So huge database. And when we did our end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA, we obviously presented our development in that context, and the FDA acknowledged the importance of the Asian data. Obviously, they want to see that the safety profile is similar in US patients compared to Japanese patients, and obviously that's why we're conducting the phase 3 trials right now. But they did allow us, because of the significant Asian data, they did allow us to do a smaller program than would normally be required for a brand new molecular entity. And they also agreed that we didn't have to do the standard replicate clinical trials, that we could do one focused on gout flare as an endpoint and one focused on tophus resolution for an endpoint. So I think, we took that into consideration, and I think there was good acknowledgement from the FDA of the importance of that Asian database in the totality of the data that we'll ultimately present to them.
And what does the path look like both to a regulatory filing and a potential approval?
Yeah, likely regulatory filing in the second half of 2028 and then approval second half of 2029 and then launch of the drug thereafter.
And Crystalys launched with a substantial Series A. How much did you raise, and who were the key investors?
Yeah, I believe it was the largest single Series A private raise in the US last year. It was $205 million. The Series A financing was led by Novo Ventures, Catalyst Pacific, who were our co-founders, along with SR1. We had a total of 13 investors involved. We also had Zontogeny, Lightstone, AN Ventures, Aberdeen, KB Investments, Pontifax, Longwood Fund, Alexandria, Wedbush Healthcare Partners, and the Prebis Venture Fund. So a really nice group of investors that were are strongly committed to what we're doing here.
So you did that during what was still a tough time for biotech financing. Why do you think you were successful, and did you notice any specific concerns that investors have that are now shifting at all?
Yeah, so I think, Danny, you're right. It was an extremely hard time to raise money. I think the fact that we were able to raise so much money, there's really two reasons behind that. One, this is really an extremely highly de-risked molecule, given that it's approved in two major territories already and has been used for over 5 years in Japan with the 2.2 million patients exposed. So a very well defined molecule, and I think investors recognize that. And I think that's combined with the fact that the team that I've put together, has previous strong gout drug development experience in this area. In fact, we're the only team that's had success in getting approval for a URAT1 inhibitor in both the US and Europe in the past. So a team with proven experience that really understand this disease and really understand the regulatory pathway to approval. I think one of the biggest questions that we got, as we were raising the money was, how big is this market, and are big pharma going to be interested in this space in terms of partnering with you ultimately? And I think that question was very nicely answered a couple of months ago when one of our competitors, Arthrosi Therapeutics, were acquired by Sobi for a pre-phase 3 deal worth $1.5 billion, with $950 million of that being paid as cash up front. I think that, made people sit up, take notice and say, well, clearly Sobi think that there's a big unmet medical need here, and that the URAT1 mechanism of action is something that, is going to be able to address that. So I think that's helpful for everybody, and particularly for patients in terms of getting new medicines to the market.
Is the expectation that you'll build your own commercial team or look for a partner?
Yes, no, our plan is to, and it's always been my plan all through every drug development that I've done, is that we should, take control of our own destiny. So our plan is to take this through development, approval, and ultimate commercialization. And we had just announced last month that we just added Tim Walbert, who was the CEO of Horizon Pharmaceuticals, who marketed and made a great success of Crystalys, the third line gout treatment that I talked about. So he and his team have got tremendous experience of launching gout products into this rheumatology specialty care market. So Tim will be extremely helpful in terms of guiding us how to prepare for that commercialization. But our plan is to do that on our own.
Is there plans to build out a pipeline behind this?
Yeah, we're currently, our main focus right now is obviously, the Datinurad phase 3 program. But in parallel with that, we are looking at a range of other potential assets to add to the pipeline, both in the gout or the chronic kidney space. Those discussions and evaluations are relatively early at this stage, but we'll continue with those. And if we find something that we believe is a molecule worthy of investment, then obviously we'll take steps to add that to the pipeline.
James Mackay, CEO of Crystalys. James, thanks as always.
It's been a pleasure, Danny, as always. Nice to talk with you.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send an email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.